Hi guys, welcome to module P6. In this module, we'll be taking an introduction to APIs from both the server and the client side. Our main objective in this module is to learn how web APIs work, how clients make requests to web APIs, and also what JSON is, which is a very popular format and almost now the modern default standard for exchanging information while making API requests and receiving API responses. We'll do this by solving several small tasks over this module, and the very first thing that we'll do is update our profile page. We'll add a new image, we'll add two sections, and we'll add a footer area. On this modified profile page, we'll start making changes to be able to make API requests and receive responses to API requests. Alright, so let's head to our coding console. So the first thing that we want to do is change the image, and so I'll go to my Twitter profile, click on this image, right click, open image in new tab, grab this image and replace that here. So now I'll have a different image that comes up. I also want to use the same styling that we were using for article 123, which was that we had a container and where all the content was centered. So I'll do div class equal to container, and I'll move all of these one step inside. I'll disable this JavaScript because I don't want an alert box to come up every single time I load my page. And so that's my image. Let's put a horizontal line here. Let's add a small heading that says personal. And let's open up a div, and we can write here, hi, my name is. And now let's add a block. Let's create another horizontal line, and this is the professional information about me. So let's say professional, and I'll say hi, I work at Hasura. Let's add another horizontal line, and now here we'll add, let's say, a small footer area. I'm just going to call it a footer. It's not really a footer, right? And we won't put any content here for now. Let's just see what this looks like. Cool. So I have a little profile page now, and what we'll do is I can see that there's a lot of extra space here which I don't want. So I'm just going to remove both the horizontal line and the brick. And so then this space will vanish, and that's what my site will look like. So now this is the scaffold that we have. Let's save this. So now what we want to do is we're going to add a counter endpoint. And what this counter endpoint will do is it will be a new URL on our server, just like say slash or slash article1 or article2. We're going to have a new endpoint, and what this endpoint will do is that it will increment a counter. The first time I go to this endpoint, it will give me a 1. The next time I go, it will give me a 2. If somebody else goes to this endpoint, it will be 3. Then if I go to the endpoint, it will be 4. So let's see what that would look like. And so I go to server.js, and I'm going to add a line of code that says /counter. And if the /counter request is made, use this function, and this function takes the value of counter and increments it by 1. It responds with that value of counter, but counter is a number, so let's convert that to a string using toString, right? We need to initialize the value of counter, so let's say var counter equal to 0. So that means counter is initialized to 0 when the server started, and every time you go to a /counter, the counter variable will be incremented, and then the response will be sent, which is that counter. Now remember that you can only send a string as a response. You can't really send a number as a response, right? The number has to be converted to a string format to be sent as a response. So let's save this, and let's go to our endpoint. So let's go to /counter, wait for our server to restart, and you can see that a 1 has appeared. I refresh this again, 2, 3, 4, 5. In fact, I can go to some other page, make a ton of these requests, and it becomes 12. And so if I refresh this, it should be 13. And so now you can see 13 here. So that means anybody going to this counter will increment this counter value. So we added a counter endpoint by adding some server-side JavaScript. Let's now add a counter button on the home page, and every time the button is clicked, we'll show an increased counter value. So let's see what this code looks like. The first thing is that we'll have to go to our home page, which is index.html, and in our footer, let's add some code. So it says this button, and then let's put a button here. So let's say button, let's give the button a name. So let's say button is called counter. Let's call the button click me. So this button has been clicked 0 times, right? And what I've done is I've given this button a name, and I've given this area, which is called a span, I've given this span a name. So by default, when I look at the index.html, it will render with this button has been clicked 0 times, right? So let's save this. Let's see what our server responds with. So the home page. So you can see that I have a little footer that says this button has been clicked 0 times, right? Let's actually add the JavaScript to this to make the request and then see the latest value of the counter here, right? So let's go to our main.js, which is where our JavaScript code is. So let's remove the old code. The first thing that we want to do is select our button, and so let's get our button by doing a document.get element by id counter, and then when this button is clicked, let's attach a function to it. And what should this function do? Well, ideally this function should first make a request to the counter endpoint and capture the response and store it in a variable, render the variable in the correct span, right? So let's try to do just this last bit first, which is rendering the variable in the correct span, because we already know how to do this. So we'll say that if we have a counter variable, let's assume that a counter variable came, and for now let's just add that code here, and I'll say that my span, let's select the span in the document. So I'll say document.get element by id, and I'll select count, and then I'll set the inner HTML to the counter value. Let's initialize the counter. So that means every time I click on this, the counter variable will go up by 1, and then it will get shown here, right? But this is not what we want to do, because we haven't done the request part yet. So let's just check if this is working. Save this, restart our server, and so our server is loaded. Now if I click on it, you can see that the value is increasing, right? And this has nothing to do though with the counter endpoint. So the counter endpoint is still probably at 1, and if you try that out, you can see the counter endpoint is just at 1, right? Let's now see how we make a request. So the first thing that we do is create a request variable and use something called a XML HTTP request. This is the documentation for this you can find at developer.mozilla. So you'll see XML HTTP request. Let's see how a request is made. So I go to the documentation for XML HTTP request, and let's go to an example. Right? So the way a request object works is that once a request is made, the browser will tell us if the response is received. And a request can be in multiple stages. So a request is just opened, a request has been sent, the response is loading, the response has loaded successfully. So there are various states that a request can be in. And in our case, when we want to capture the response, right, what we have to do is detect the change in the state. So request.onReadyStateChange. If the request state changes, then execute this function. And what this function does is that it checks the current state of the request object, and if that is equal to XML HTTP request.done, which means that the request is successfully completed, we want to take some action. But if it's not done yet, we don't want to do anything, right? So let's ignore that part. What is the action that we want to take? We first want to check if this was a successful request. So then what we want to do is check if request.status is 200. Now if the request status is 200, that means the request is successfully completed, right? And then what we want to do is extract the value from this request. So what we want to do is we want to say request dot, so you want to capture the response text, so we'll say request dot response text, and this gives us access to the respond value, which will have a number, and we'll say that our counter variable, so we'll say var counter is equal to this response text, right? And then what we'll do is we'll change and we can remove the old code here, remove the old code from here as well. And so now what we're doing is we're saying that if the request results in 200, the request status is 200, then take the response and put it in the counter variable, and take the counter variable and put it inside the span, right? So this is what we do once we receive the response from the request, right? But we haven't actually made the request yet, so let's make the request, right? And let's change this comment to create a request object. So JavaScript makes us think in strange ways sometimes, because we need to think about what to do once we receive the request response before we actually make the request, right? And so now let's make the request by doing a request.open, and we want to make a GET request to our own servers. Let's coco98.imad.hasura.hasura.app.io, and we want to go to the counter variable. So this is when I'm actually making the request, right? And once this request is made and the request state changes to the request is done, then our code will be executed here, right? So let's try to see this in action. Refresh our page here. Cool. So let's click on this and you can see that it's working, right? It's changed here. Let's go to inspect element and go to the network tab, and let's just clear this. So resize this. So every time I click here, you can see that a request is made, right? Every time I'm clicking here, a new request is made, which also means that if I go to the counter endpoint by myself, right, and the values become 13, once I click on this button, the new value will be 14, right? Because that's the counter variable that's being. So this is me making a request and getting the response and showing the response on the page without refreshing the page. So now what we did is we actually made a data call. We did not make a request for an HTML page. We did not make a request for a JavaScript file or a CSS file, but we actually made a request just for a piece of data. And then we took that piece of data and we converted it into an HTML string. And converting the data into an HTML string was very similar to what the server did. And once we converted that into an HTML string, we inserted that HTML string into the existing HTML document. This business of making calls to the web server without refreshing the page is called making AJAX calls. And in fact, some modern web apps these days don't need to be refreshed at all. So you will never see a page load. A prime example of this is an app like Gmail. These web apps are called single page apps because there is only one page that loads, and all the action, all the change in data, and all the change in the UI happens within that single page. This activity of templating on the browser, and where I use the word templating to refer to converting data into HTML, which was an activity that we usually did on the server. This action is called client-side templating, and this is how all of Gmail works. And in fact, if you open up inspect element when Gmail is loading, you'll see that when you load mail.google.com, only a blank page with a kind of loading bar loads, and the JS files load and the CSS files load, and the JavaScript files have the JavaScript that when executed make a request to the Gmail server, and fetch the email content, and you'll actually be able to see the requests that are fetching emails, and in the response you'll see the email data being given, and the JavaScript that is loaded converts the data that is sent back from the browser and converts that into HTML, and that is how your inbox is actually rendered. So if you think about these more complex use cases like Gmail, it's not just about making a request to a URL endpoint. Sometimes you need to send data to the server. So for example, in Gmail, when you're searching through your email and you give it a search string, or on some modern e-commerce sites when you keep scrolling and new products keep loading. In this case, we're not just making a request for getting new pieces of data. We're making a request, but we're also sending a parameter. So we're sending some data, for example, a query string, or we're saying that we've already loaded 10 products, give us 10 to 20, and then give us products from 20 to 30. So we're sending some kind of data to the server. In all of these cases, also the response from the server is not just an integer or a string representation of an integer, which is what we looked at when we were using the counter example. In this case, the response is far more complicated. For example, you have an object or an array of data items that are being sent back as a response. How do we approach these more complex scenarios? So we'll try to understand this by doing a small task. In this small task, we'll add an input box on our page, and when we click a button, the data will be taken from the input box, which will say be a name, and it will be sent to the server. The server will then respond with all the names that have been submitted to the server so far. And once we get these list of names, we'll show them on the page as a bulleted list. So let's see how this task is done. So I head to the IMAD console. Now I want to change the index.html to add, let's put a breakpoint here, and let's add an input box. Let's say input type equal to text, and let's say ID equal to name, right? And let's say input. We want a placeholder, so let's put a placeholder that says name, and we'll see what the placeholder text is. And then we'll also have a little button, which is a submit button, right? And let's say it will say submit. And once this is done, we'll want to see a list of all the names. So this is kind of what we want the list to be like: name 1, name 2, name 3. So let's save this. Let's check out what this looks like. So this is kind of what we want to see, where if I enter a name and I click on submit, I want the first item to change to ASD, AFA, SDF, and then change to name 1, name 2, name 3. So that's kind of what I would like to see, right? And let's just clean this up a little more so that we have more spacing here. Maybe we can change this to add perhaps another horizontal line. So we'll put another horizontal line here that will look a little neater. This is kind of what we want to implement, right? And we have the HTML. Now let's write the JavaScript for it. So I go back here, I'll quickly change this to a horizontal line, and let's go to our main.js file. So now we'll say submit name, right? So let's capture the name. So we'll say the name input is equal to document.get element by ID, and the name of the input box was name, and the value of the name is name input.value. What we'll need to do next is var submit button is equal to document.get element by ID, and we'll call this submit button, and submit dot on click will be a function. And let's write the pseudocode for this function. So this function should make a request to the server and send the name, capture a list of names and render it as a list, right? So already we can see that 2-3 things are missing. The first thing is that we need to have the submit button label attached. So let's go to index.html, and let's have an ID for this input button. So let's say ID is equal to submit button. So now we can actually capture the submit button. Let's again go over the making a request business last, and let's just say for now we have a list of names as an example. So let's say var names is equal to name1, name2, name3, right? So here's a list of our names. Let's convert this into an HTML string. So I'll say var list is equal to, let's say this is an empty string, and I'll iterate over these elements. So I'll say start with 0, go on till names.length I++, and for each element in the list add this string to the list element. So I'll say li plus names of I, so that's the name that we have in this iteration, and then let's close the li element, right? So that's our list element, and now once we have this, we need to insert that HTML into our unordered list. So we have var ul is equal to document dot get element by id name list, and so we'll do ul dot inner HTML is equal to list, right? So this should change the list that we have. So let's try to test this code out. Let's initially make sure that the list has nothing, right? And let's make sure that we have the ID, which we use the name list. So now if I click on this button, name list should have these three names, name1, name2, name3. Let's just add name4 here as an exercise, right? So this would mean that our rendering or templating bit is working, and then we'll figure out later on how to make a request to the server. So let's just test if this bit is working. Refresh the page. Let's click on this button and see what happens. And as soon as I clicked on this button, you see that name1, name2, name3, 4 got displayed here. So now we want to figure out how to make a request to the server. But before we make a request to the server should actually be listening to the request. So let's add an endpoint on the server. So let's say we add one called app.get /submit-name. Let's put slash in the beginning, /submit-name, and if that happens, we'll execute a particular function. And this function will, so what will this function do? We want our function to get the current name somehow. So get the name from the request object, and let's say we extracted this name somehow, right? And once we extracted the name value, we want to concatenate it to our overall list of names. So we'll have, let's say, names dot push name, right? And once it's pushed, let's somehow return that response. So we need to do something like a rest.send of names, right? And so let's initialize the names array. So var names equal to this. So what is definitely not clear, and we can clearly see that 2-3 things are deeply missing here, right? So the first part is, how are we going to extract the name from the request? And the second part is, how are we going to send the names? Because names is an array now, and this is a JavaScript object. How can we send a JavaScript object or a JavaScript array as a string? Because we know that when we do rest.send, we can actually just send down bytes or string or a text value. How can we send down an array? That does not make sense. So let's take this one step at a time. The first thing that we want to do is, let's see if we can extract the name from the request. Let's use the same technique that we used here, right? So let's send the data as a part of the URL object. So we can do /name, right? So the URL request that we'll be making is /submit name, and then there'll be a parameter, and whatever this parameter is will be called the variable name, right? So we'll use the same technique as we used earlier, and we'll say this is equal to rec.params.name. So this is one part of the problem solved. The next thing that we'll want to do is convert this array into a string. And the best way of converting JavaScript objects, right? In this case, we had a very simple example where we just have an array of strings. But what if we had an array of objects? For example, if you look at this data structure, it's actually an object which contains more objects, nested objects inside it. So these are complicated objects. How do we convert these objects to string? And this is where a format called JSON comes in. And so JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So JavaScript Object Notation is a way of converting JavaScript objects into strings. And so what we can actually do is we can say json.stringify, and this will convert the array into a string, right? So let's put this in action and see what this looks like. And let's go to /submit-name and let's enter a test name here. So I'm entering my name, Tanmay. So you can see Tanmay, and every time I make a new request, another element gets added to the array, right? And so if I change this to something else, you can see that something else gets added here, right? So Ramu, you'll see Ramu gets added here. This is one way of getting the information as a part of the URL and then sending that information back as JSON. So let's look at another way of sending data, and this is called a query parameter. So query parameter, if you remember from week 1, was the bit of a URL that is usually after a question mark. So let's remove it from here. And so now what we expect our request to be is something like this, /submit-name question mark name equal to something, right? And this is the bit that we want. So now the question is, how do we extract this part from the request object? And Express again gives us a convenient way to extract this, because this is called a query parameter string. We can just do query.name and the same thing will work. So let's quickly put this in action. You can see that we're getting an error, and that error is coming from line number 46 on server.js, which itself is coming from line number 96 in server.js. And so it seems that this code is what is trying to be executed, server 96, and obviously because 96 is using articles, the error seems to be coming from line number 46, right? So the first question that we have to ask is, why is this getting executed and not this? And the reason for that is because our URL match pattern comes after this. The URL match pattern for article name is getting executed, and it's not able to find an article name that corresponds to submit name. And the simple way to fix this problem is to remove this from here and put this here, right? So this is something that was peculiar to Express and the way Express handles URL routing. So now let's try to save this and see what happens. And so we see that it's working. We're getting Sham. Let's change this to Ram. We're getting Ram. And then let's get something. And so it's working, right? So now we have our URL endpoint, which takes a name and which returns a list of names. So let's add that code to our main.js. So I'm going to copy this code from here. Right, and what we want to do is, if the request is successful, this time instead of incrementing a counter, we want to do rendering our name list. So let's copy our code there. So that's the bit that's rendering it. And now what we want to do is change the place where the request is made. So we won't make it to counter, we'll make it to submit name, and we want to say name equal to, and this value will come from the input box. So we'll do plus name here, right? So what is going to happen is that first we're going to select the input box, we're going to extract the value from the input box, and then whenever the submit button is clicked, we'll create a request object and we'll send the request to this URL. Once we send the request to this URL and we get a 200 response, which is a successful response, we will get the list of names, right, which we haven't changed yet. So we'll get the list of names and we will render the list of names. So let's change this last bit here, which instead of hard coding these list of names, let's actually get that from the response. And so what we'll do is we'll say var names request dot response text, right? But again, if you look at this names, it will actually be a string. It won't be a JavaScript array. So let's do the reverse of what we did on the server, and we'll do json.parse, not json.stringify. So we'll convert it from string back into an object, or in this case, an array, right? So we converted that into an array, and then our code should continue to work. So let's save this and let's head to the home page. Let's enter something here. So let's say thumbnail. Alright, so we can see that nothing's getting rendered here. So let's try to find out what the bug is. So the way I try to find what the bug is, I go to inspect element, which opens the developer tools window. Over the course of the video, I've been using the word inspect element and open inspect element when actually this window is called developer tools. So the right word is to open developer tools, and I frequently call that inspect element. That's the wrong name. So now if you look at the request that is being sent, it seems to be sending a request to there's no name value that is being sent, and which is why the response that we're getting are two empty strings, because it's receiving an empty string, right? So let's try to find out why we are sending an empty string. So the way I debug this is typically go to the sources tab and I try to find out why we're not able to capture the right value, right? So let's just try to execute this code on the console. So I'm going to take the same code and I'm going to copy it on the console, and I'll see if, so name input is in fact the input box. Let's then try to capture this value. So this is also correct. Name is in fact ADSF, which is exactly what I've written here. So far so good. And then when I'm clicking on click, something seems to go wrong when name is not getting rendered here. So it seems that when the code comes to this portion, the value of name is not available anymore, right? So, and the reason why we think this is happening is because the value of name was extracted once here. We should be extracting the value of name on click, because by the time our code gets here and starts executing this code, the value of name is the value of name that it was when the document first loaded. It is not refreshing the value of name according to what has been typed. And that means that our error is that we need to move this portion of the code inside the onClick function. So let's try doing that. Right? So this means that when I click on the button submit, that is when I try to extract the value from the input element. I don't try to extract it in the very beginning when the document is loaded. I extract it only when I click on the button. So let's save this. Let's try to enter a name here. And you can see that the name has appeared. So let's try to enter another name here, ASDF. And you can see that ASDF, it takes a little bit of time to appear because it's making the request to the server and the response is coming back. The key takeaways in this module are the following. An API endpoint is technically the same thing as a normal URL endpoint. It's just that a URL endpoint typically is used to return all kinds of content like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, or images. But an API endpoint is typically used only for exchanging data. So you can request some data and you can get a response that contains data. An API endpoint can also return data in any format. So it can return data in a text, in a string. But for more complex pieces of data and for more complex data structures, a very common format is called JSON. And a JSON format is basically the string representation of a JavaScript object. The task for you guys is to try to add a comment box on every article page, have an input box, let people type a comment into the input box, and once something is typed, display a list of all the comments that have ever been typed so far and display it on the bottom of the article page. Over the last few practical modules, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. In this entire course, we are not going to be learning any specific programming language or framework. This course is only about learning the right fundamentals and just enough specifics to build a basic app. So over the next 2 weeks, when we return to more theory about databases, performance, security, concurrency, use that time to build your ultimate profile and blog app. Right? So add a lot of styling, add comments, add a list of articles on the home page that link directly to the article page, and add other features that do whatever you want. There is no limit to what you should or you should not do. The two important things for you to learn if you are going to get into web development more seriously, especially on the front end side of things, is to use Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework for CSS, and jQuery, which is a framework for writing JavaScript. So it makes writing JavaScript more easy. And both these links you can see in the slides if you go to the slides.